once the church became legalized in the Roman world under Emperor Constantine, and then after his death, it became the official religion of the Roman Empire. But that doesn't take away all the problems. In fact, before it became the official religion, there is something that happens within the church in the wake of the previous persecution called the Donatist controversy. So in your notes, you should see a place there for the conflict within the church, the Donatist controversy. The issues are these. First of all, during the worldwide persecution of the church in 313, some Christians gave up sacred books. So when they were asked for copies of the scriptures, some Christians gave them up. Well, the question is the same one that we faced before. You'll remember, should those people be readmitted into the church? Well, the one party called the rigorists, you know what rigor means? That means straight, hard, the hardliners, you might call them, said that these people should have accepted martyrdom and not given up the books. And if they gave them up, they should be excommunicated. Purity is characteristic of the church. So that may sound like the Novatians before. Remember, Novatus was among the party that didn't want to readmit people into the church after they had offered, or actually after they just purchased false certificates of sacrifice. Okay, here's the same kind of issue. These people, though, gave up the scriptures. At the very least, they said any overseer or bishop who cooperated with the persecutors could never confer valid ordination, baptism, or communion. So if a person was a bishop and had given up the scriptures, he can never oversee a baptism again, or ordaining someone to ministry, or oversee communion. He's done as a leader. All right, got the picture? Now there were those that were called moderates who said that discretion should be shown. So, in other words, don't take a hard line on this. Let's do it case by case. Well, in 311, a churchman by the name of Donatus, that's why it's called the Donatist controversy, Donatus wanted to exclude a man by the name of Cecilian from his office as Bishop of Carthage because Felix, who had been a traitor during the Diocletian persecution, had consecrated him. All right, so get the picture here. Donatus said, well, let's we'll call you the names, okay? So let's say that Griff is Donatus, and Stephen is Felix, and John is the other guy who has a strange name, say Cillian. All right, so Felix gave up the scriptures during the persecution. So some say he shouldn't be able to do anything in the church now. But he ordained, what's your name? Cecilius. Yeah, so but he ordained Cecilius. And so Donatus comes along and says, no, you can't be functioning as an ordained person. You can't be functioning as a leader of the church. Why? Because you were ordained by somebody who shouldn't be allowed to ordain anybody. You follow? So it becomes an issue as to who can ordain who. Donatus argued that the failure to remain true during the persecution invalidated the power of Felix to ordain because he had thus committed an unpardonable sin. Remember Novatus? So Donatus and his group elected Majorius to be the bishop instead of Cecilius. So, if we wanted to get him around, we would move Noah over to take his place. So he's going to be the bishop. And after Majorius, then Donatus became bishop. Now, what happens is some people still recognize Cecilius, and so now we've got two bishops. in the same city. All right, so now Constantine is still emperor. And so he kind of adds to the mix here because he gave money to the African church where this is taking place in Carthage. And the Donatists didn't get any. And so they're complaining that they should have gotten the money instead of these guys. So see how confusing it was? Well, Augustine, who's a guy we haven't come to yet, except to mention him, but a very big man in Carthage, wanted to mediate. He wanted to try to work things out. And he said this: the distinguishing characteristic of the church is not holiness. In other words, it's not whether you have been perfect and not ever made any mistakes, but love and unity. He said that there ought to be love between us. There ought to be unity, not this fighting over this stuff. Secondly, he says, the one church consists of wheat and tares, so let them stay. Now, do you remember the story that Jesus told about the wheat and the tares? He tells a story about a man who had planted wheat in his fields, but an enemy came in and sowed tares. Now, do you know what tares are? I'm not sure what the modern translations may just use weeds. So somebody came in and sowed weeds. Well, in the biblical times, the particular kind of wheat, I think it's called a darnel, looks just like wheat. And so when they're growing up, you can't tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds. Does that ever happen in your yard? I don't know. You can tell the difference between, sometimes you look out there and say, I don't know if it's grass or if it's weeds, but it's green, so let it go. But the servants of the man said, well, let's go out there and pull out all the weeds. And the guy said, no, don't do that because you might pull up wheat instead because you really can't tell the difference right now. And so Jesus said that's the way that the church is. That there are going to be those that are in the church that don't belong. They're weeds. But don't you try to pull them out. The angels will take care of that at the end when they have the final harvest. All right, so Augustine is saying, you know, there are wheat and tares in the church. Just let it go. Don't try to, be kicking one another out of the church. Just let it be. Next, he says, the line of apostolic succession can identify the one true church. In other words, the line of the teaching of the apostles that has come down through the men of the church can identify the one true church. So let the teachings of the apostles take control here. Next, he said, no one is in the church unless one is in that body of apostolic succession. In other words, if you're not in agreement with the doctrines that have come down from the apostles, you're not in the church anyway. And if you're not in the true church, then you're not really saved. So in other words, there needs to be a submission to the church that is centered around the doctrines that the apostles have passed on. Otherwise, let love and unity reign here. And if somebody doesn't agree with the doctrine of the apostles, then let them go. Go. But let's not be fighting over this particular issue. All right, so the outcome was this. A synod, that is a gathering together of bishops, was held at Rome, and they decided that the validity of a sacrament, whether it's baptism or communion, does not depend on the character of the one administering the sacrament. So in other words, if I'm taking communion, the validity of that doesn't depend on the person who's doing it. If I'm baptized, the validity of my baptism doesn't depend on the one who's baptizing me. And so the Donatists, he says, have no right to any of the money that Constantine was given because they're wrong. They're making the person who is performing the function more important than the function itself. You follow? So he's basically saying it doesn't matter who baptizes you. That's not the important part. The important part is you're being baptized. You don't look at the character of the one doing it and say, oh, well, Zach's baptism isn't valid because John did it and John's a scoundrel. He's a nasty guy, and so that means his baptism is no good. So now he's got to get baptized by somebody else instead. That's just ridiculous. And so Augustine is pointing that out. So that's the first part. Then, well, then what happens in 314? There's a council where Cecilian, who's played by John here, was recognized as the sole bishop. And remember, he was the one who was appointed by the guy who had given up scriptures. So basically, the Donatists lose out on this. They're trying to declare invalid anything that these guys do, but they lose out. From 397 to 412, there's a series of councils in Carthage. Augustine's ideas prevailed, and Donatus was condemned. So the one who was trying to condemn others became condemned himself. Well, in 428, it didn't much matter anymore because Vandals invaded North Africa, destroyed the church, and there's no church there anymore. There's no more controversy. So that's one way to eliminate it. Everybody's just gone. All right, so that's the Donatists, and it's just a reminder of what happened before with the Novatian controversy. All right, any questions about the Donatists? It's just one of those hiccups in church history that took place, which kind of demonstrate to us that we need to judge, what a person is doing, not who is doing it to them. What's the purpose of baptism or communion or any of these things, and try to have a little bit of grace toward people. All right, we go on now. We're going to look at some theological controversies that took place in relationship or within the church, and first in the area of theology proper. That is in the area of studying God himself. Or we could say Christology for this first controversy as well. And this concerned the question, who was Christ before the incarnation? All right. Is that a legitimate question? That's something that maybe many of us might wonder. Well, before Jesus was born in a manger in Bethlehem, just exactly who was he, or what was he? What was his existence? You can see why people would want to know about that, right? Well, the person who brings it to the forefront is a guy by the name of Arius. You see his name here, Arius. Although the drawing of him makes him look like a villain, doesn't it? And he's going to turn out to be one, as you'll see. The beginning of the Arian controversy was involving the views of Arius. As a man, he was an ascetic scholar. So he was a person who lived very simply, did not believe in having luxury, things like that. He was trained by a man by the name of Lucan of Antioch. Now, his name would really be unimportant, except he's going to come up a little bit later. Now, Lucan of Antioch was a dynamic monarchianist. In other words, he was a guy that believed that God adopted Jesus as the Christ, that he didn't exist as God beforehand. Now, Arius was a great preacher. People like to listen to him, and maybe even more importantly, a songwriter. We'll find throughout church history that people who write songs often can persuade many others to believe what they say. There are some songs that we sing that we need to examine. Is this song really true? We should do that from time to time in looking at songs. Well, he was desirous of avoiding a polytheistic conception of God. In other words, when people talked about Jesus being God and the Father being God, to him, that sounded like we've got more than one God. And he said, we can't have that. We can't have polytheism. We can't have many gods. And so there's got to be a way to explain who Christ was before the incarnation that doesn't make him God, because then we'd have more than one God. You see his dilemma? So in his work, Thalia, he explains. He says, God was not always Father, but there was when God was alone and was not yet Father. Afterward, he became a Father. The Son was not always. For since all things have come into existence from nothing, and all things are creatures and have been made, so also the Logos of God, the Son of God, himself came into existence from nothing, and there was a time when he was not. What's he saying? He goes on, and that before he came into existence, he was not. But he also had a beginning of his being created. For God, he says, was alone, and not yet was there the Logos and wisdom. Afterward, he willed to create us. Then he made a certain one and named him Logos and wisdom and son, in order that by him he might create us. All right, so what's he saying about the Son of God here? The Logos. What's he saying in your own words? John?
Like he wasn't there and then he just became and was adopted by God.
Yeah, so there was a time, the key phrase here, there was a time when he was not. There was a time when the Son of God did not exist, which means that he is not the eternal God.
Excuse me, I have to correct my mistake. You were right. I found that thing at the British Museum.
Ah,
It's in the Assyrian collection. I've been in the room that it's in. I don't remember seeing it, ever.
that was just a guess on my part.
You were right. It's there. I found it.
Great,
Sorry for interrupting.
thank you. It was something that I was talking about in teacher devotions this morning. We're looking at something from the Assyrian Empire. And someone asked me where it was. I said, well, it's probably in the British Museum in London. That's where a lot of things end up. And Mr. Chapin said, I've been there many times. I've never seen it. But he looked it up and found that's where it is. All right. So for those of you at home, a little extra information at no extra cost. All right. So Arius is saying that there was a time when Jesus did not exist, when the Son did not exist, which means he is not fully God, right? You see that? So he is not fully God. He was a created being. Is that problematic?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's look at some of the areas in which it's a problem. First of all, the soteriological implications I have there. Don't you love it when I use these big words? What does soteriological mean? Do you remember? We've had this word before. Soteriology, soteriological. It also starts with S. It has to do with salvation. If I give you everything but with the shun, you're going to get it, right? Soteriological means salvation. So what are the implications for salvation if Jesus is not fully God? Well, let's look. And maybe you could think of this on your own, but let's take a look here. The statement is this, or the question is this. Could Christ save man if he were a demigod, that is kind of a sub-God, less than true God, and of a similar, or it should be, or different essence from the Father? So in other words, could Christ save man if he was not fully God? That's the question. And the answer, I think you know, is what? No. Secondly, and just what was his relationship to the Father? If he's not fully God, then what is he to the Father? All right. So those are the issues that now are swirling through the church as Arius's teachings are being promoted. You know, as people are singing his songs on the radio, and they're promoting this stuff, and you guys don't even bat an eyelash. You know there were no radios back then, right? Okay. Just making sure. Sometimes I have students write that stuff down when I'm going over the top and don't even think about it. Okay, next, we have a clash. The clash with Bishop Alexander of Alexandria. Okay, I should put this slide up here. It shows you that in eternity past, there was a beginning for Christ. Then the other creatures, after time was initiated by God, were created, but Christ was created back here before that. All right, so Alexander, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, So you can remember that. Alexander of Alexandria was teaching something different than Arius. And so Arius accused Alexander of patripassianism. Do you remember what that is? The Father suffers. So in other words, he was accusing Alexander of saying that if Jesus is God, then the Son and the Father must be the same thing. And that's not what Alexander was saying. Oops, there's that key phrase. Make sure you get that. I'm going to ask you that over and over again, not only this year, but in coming years. All right? There was a time when he was not, is Arianism. Alexander was being accused by Arius of being a patripassianist. Alexander then accused Arius of dynamic monarchianism, which is that God adopted Jesus as the Christ, essentially. So Alexander called together a council of bishops where they judged Arius and they separated him from the church as a heretic. This is a local council. So Arius then fled to Eusebius of Nicomedia, who is not the same Eusebius that we've seen before. It's a different one. Who's also a student of Lucan. Remember I said before that Arius was a student of Lucan? And so he goes to a place, a bishop, that was also a student of Lucan. So they were in agreement on this stuff. And they both continued teaching what this local council had declared was wrong. And it began causing disunity in the Roman Empire. So these teachings are going around, and basically it's causing a lot of turmoil because some people are saying, no, that's definitely wrong. Other people are saying, no, I think that sounds right. And so there's fighting going on. Well, because of the disruption in the empire, the Emperor Constantine decided this is causing too much turmoil. We've got to put a stop to this because I like to have a nice peaceful empire. I don't like it when people are fighting one another. So we're going to have a resolution here. So Constantine actually calls a council of the church. And you might say, does the emperor have the authority to call a council of the church bishops to come together? And the answer to that would be no, but he did. And so the bishops come together at a town outside of Constantinople, where the palace was, in order to restore unity. And this is the first great council of the church, called the Council of Nicaea. Now, technically, there was a church council before this, back in Acts 15, but this is the first one since then. A great ecumenical council. Many of the bishops who attended this council, in fact, had been around long enough that they had been imprisoned during the persecution under Diocletian. And so they take these things very seriously. You know, what is truth? One of these men who had been persecuted under Diocletian, his name was Nicholas, and he was from the city of Myra, M-Y-R-A. Now, he was known for his generosity. In fact, one of the things one of the stories is that there was a man with several daughters who didn't have a dowry to use for his daughters to get married. You know, in some cultures, the woman has to bring money along with her in order to get married. And so Nicholas apparently snuck in at night, or somehow got in there and left some gold in the girls' stockings so that they would have a dowry to get married. He later, of course, was declared a saint, and so you've heard of Saint Nicholas, Saint Nick, also known as Santa Claus. This is the real guy. All right, so he's at this council. Saint Nick is there. Sorry, he didn't have on a red suit or anything, but he's there, and he's going to do something very interesting. Oh, I don't know if we'll get to it today or not. We'll see. All right, at this Council of Nicaea, three parties emerged. First of all, there's the party of Arius and Eusebius of Nicomedia. Now, Arius is not a bishop, So he's not allowed to speak. All right, keep that in mind. So Eusebius has to do all the talking here for Arianism. Arius is not allowed to speak. He's there, but he can't talk. This is what they said. They said Christ had not existed from all eternity, but had a beginning by the creative act of God prior to time, which is just what I showed you back here. Before time, Christ was created, but he was not in eternity past with God the Father. Secondly, they said Christ is of a different substance or essence than God the Father. So in other words, he doesn't have the same makeup as God the Father. They are a different substance. And they call that heterousios. It's a Greek word, and not that hard for you to understand if you look at it for a moment. Hetero. Do you know any words that begin with hetero? I know you know at least one. Can you think of any? It means different. How about the word heterosexual? Do you know that word? What does that mean? It means you're attracted to someone of a different, do I have to say the whole thing? What? Gender, right? So you're attracted to the opposite sex. That's a heterosexual, right? Don't you know that term?
Yeah.
You've heard that, I'm sure. Heterosexual. Well, here it means hetero means different. Ousios means substance or essence. So that what he's saying is that God the Father and God the Son are of a different essence. They don't have the same substance. They're not made up of the same, not material, but really, but of the same thing. All right. So they use that word for that. So, but they still say Christ is to be considered divine because of the virtue of his life and his obedience to God's will. So because he lived a perfect life, we still consider him divine, even though he is not God from eternity. He was divine, but not deity. So they're kind of quibbling over words here. He's divine, but he's not deity. Now normally we consider those two things to be the same thing. But they're saying there's a difference. He said he's not co-equal, co-eternal, or consubstantial. That means with the same substance with the Father. So he's not co-equal, not co-eternal, not consubstantial. He is a different substance. He is not fully God. We got that, right? That's what Arius and Eusebius of Nicomedia are saying. Any questions about that? You got the picture of what they're saying? Got to get that before we go on. Everybody got it? Any questions? All right. Next we come to Alexander and Athanasius. Alexander was from where? Alexandria, thank you. And Athanasius was in agreement with him, and he is more of a theologian. He does a lot of writing. And they said that Christ had existed from all eternity with the Father. I mean, we have that in John chapter 1, don't we? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. You know, he was always there. Christ is of the same substance or essence as the Father, although he has a distinct personality. So they called it homoousios. Now, what does homo mean?
Same.
The same. And you know words that begin with homo.
Homosexual.
Homosexual means you're attracted to someone of the same gender. We have homogenized, which means that everything in the milk is mixed up to the extent so that everything is the same. You don't separate. You don't have the separate cream to the top and so on. So homoousios says that the Father and the Son are of the same essence. What makes them up is the same. There's not a difference between them for their makeup, but they're different persons, have different personalities. All right. He says, if Christ were less than divine, he could not be the Savior of man. If Christ is not God, he can't be the Savior. And then the fourth point, Christ is co-equal, co-eternal, and consubstantial with the Father. Lastly is Eusebius. But before we get to Eusebius tries to find a mediating position. But I want to tell you, while Alexander and Athanasius are giving their presentation, Arius starts singing. He's not allowed to talk, but he starts singing a song. And the bell's going to ring. So you'll have to wait till tomorrow to find out what his song was and what happened when he sang this song. Dun, 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 dun. All right, work on lesson 5.